The billionaire pretended to sleep to test his black maid, but what he saw left him paralyzed. The billionaire, Alexander Stone, was a man whose wealth could bend the will of cities. His empire stretched from New York to Dubai, yet his heart had hardened like marble over years of betrayal and greed. To the world, he was a visionary. To those who worked beneath him, he was a storm waiting to strike. But on this quiet Sunday morning, as the rain whispered against the windows of his Hampton mansion, Alexander sat still on his grand bed, eyes half closed, pretending to sleep. He wasn't resting. He was testing. He had hired a new maid, Grace Daniels, a black woman in her mid-30s, quiet, polite, and unfailingly kind. There was something about her calmness that unsettled him. She smiled too easily. She worked too diligently. He didn't trust that. His past housekeepers had stolen from him money, watches, even pieces of his late wife's jewelry. So when Grace started last month, he had planted small traps. A diamond cufflink left in plain sight. A wallet half open on the counter. He wanted to see who she truly was when no one was watching. And now, this morning, he would push further. He lay in bed, eyes closed, pretending to snore softly. On the nightstand sat his open briefcase. Inside, stacks of cash and an envelope of documents worth millions. Grace entered quietly, humming an old hymn, unaware that her every move was being watched through a barely open eyelid. She paused by the briefcase. The air tightened. Alexander's heart pounded in quiet anticipation. Then something unexpected happened. Grace didn't reach for the money. Instead, she picked up the photograph lying next to it, a faded picture of a woman and a small boy. His late wife. His son. Her hand trembled slightly. She whispered, "You must have loved them deeply." Her voice cracked, full of empathy, not curiosity. She gently placed the photo back, then wiped dust from the frame with her apron as if tending to a sacred thing. Alexander, pretending to sleep, felt a strange tug in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt seen. When Grace left the room, he opened his eyes, but couldn't move for a moment. His test hadn't revealed deceit. It revealed something his wealth had long buried: compassion. The following days unsettled Alexander more than the quiet act he had witnessed. Grace carried herself with dignity, her eyes never lowered even in servitude. She worked hard, sang hymns softly while cleaning, and often paused to gaze at the sea beyond the mansion's tall windows. Once, Alexander overheard her whisper, "Peace, you find it in service." He didn't understand that. For him, service was weakness, a thing to rise above. But he kept watching. One afternoon, he pretended to fall asleep again on the living room couch, just to observe. Grace entered, carrying a bucket and cloth. She began to clean around him carefully, avoiding noise. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Her expression fell. A text read, "The hospital says Mama's condition is worsening." Her eyes watered. She sank to her knees, whispering a prayer under her breath. Alexander saw everything, pretending to be asleep. Grace didn't take a break. She didn't even call back. She finished her work, wiped her tears discreetly, and whispered, "Lord, please give me strength to finish the day." When she left the room, Alexander exhaled, feeling a guilt that twisted deep inside him. Here was a woman working in silence while her mother lay dying, just to keep a job. That night, he couldn't sleep. For years, he had dismissed kindness as naivety. But watching Grace, he realized something painful. She possessed a strength his billions could never buy. A week later, Grace arrived at the mansion, unusually quiet. She moved slower, her eyes heavy with sadness. Alexander noticed, but said nothing. His instinct was always to maintain distance. Yet something inside him, a human thing he thought long dead, urged him to speak. "Grace," he said that afternoon, surprising even himself. "You seem tired. Is everything all right?" She smiled faintly. "Just a lot on my mind, sir. But I'm grateful for the work." Alexander hesitated. "You can take a few days off if needed." She shook her head quickly.
"No, sir.
My mother always said, you don't stop climbing just because the hill gets steep." She's in the hospital, but I can't afford to miss a day. Every hour counts." Her words hit him like a sermon. After she left, he sat at his desk, staring at the untouched documents before him. Deals, mergers, profit reports, all meaningless compared to the quiet dignity he had just witnessed. That evening, as Grace finished cleaning his study, she dropped a small envelope. Alexander noticed it, but said nothing until she left. When curiosity got the better of him, he opened it. Inside was a letter written in shaky handwriting. "Dear Mama, I know you're tired. I'm saving everything I can. Mr. Stone is a fair man, and I'll pay for your medicine soon. Please hold on. Love, Grace." He froze. Fair man. If only she knew the truth, that he had been testing her, doubting her, suspecting her kindness. Alexander folded the letter carefully, feeling a wave of shame rise within him. For the first time, he saw himself not as the master of the house, but as a man dwarfed by his own arrogance. Later that night, when Grace left, he went to his reflection and saw something unfamiliar. Regret. He whispered to himself, Maybe I've been the one being tested." The following morning, Alexander called his assistant. "Find out everything about Grace Daniels," he ordered curtly. Within hours, a report landed on his desk. Grace lived in a small apartment 2 hours away, paid most of her wages toward hospital bills, and supported a younger brother in college. Her mother, Evelyn Daniels, was battling heart failure in a rundown community hospital. Alexander read the file 3 times. Each line stripped another layer of his arrogance. How could someone so burdened still find room for Grace? That night, as Grace finished her shift, Alexander told her to go home early. When she left, he slipped into his car and told his driver, "Take me to St. Mary's Community Hospital." The sterile corridors smelled faintly of disinfectant and despair. He found Evelyn's ward easily, room 12, a dimly lit corner with flickering lights. There she lay, frail, oxygen tube in her nose, a soft smile on her lips. Even in her weakness, she radiated peace. He stood in silence for a moment, guilt pressing against his chest. Then he placed an anonymous envelope under her pillow, filled with enough cash to cover months of treatment. He left before she could wake. The next morning, Grace burst into the mansion, tears streaking her cheeks. "Mr. Stone." "Sir, something miraculous happened. Someone paid off my mother's hospital bills. The doctor said the donor wanted no recognition." Alexander feigned surprise. "That's wonderful news." Grace nodded, crying softly. "God is real. He answers prayers." As she turned to clean, Alexander's throat tightened. He had given away millions before, but this small act done in secret felt different. It was the first time in years he'd felt alive. That night, he watched Grace humming again, her voice softer, lighter. For the first time since his wife's death, he smiled. Weeks passed, and the mansion seemed brighter. Grace filled it with quiet life, fresh flowers in corners, sunlight through open curtains, music where silence used to dwell. Alexander began joining her for coffee under the pretense of checking on the staff. At first, their conversations were brief, about weather, work, or her mother's recovery. But slowly they deepened. "Do you ever regret taking this job?" he asked one afternoon. Grace smiled.
"No, sir."
"Every place teaches me something. Even pain can shape you for better things." Her words echoed in his mind for days. One evening, he walked into the kitchen unexpectedly and found Grace talking softly on the phone. Her laughter, light and pure, filled the air. It startled him how foreign that sound felt in his own home. When she hung up, she turned and blushed.
"Sorry, sir."
"That was my brother. He just got accepted into law school." He said, "Tell your boss thank you for giving you work." Alexander felt warmth creep into his chest. "Your brother's lucky to have you." Grace smiled. "No, sir. I'm lucky to have second chances." Later that night, he sat on his bed and stared at the ceiling. He had spent decades building walls of power, wealth, and indifference, to protect himself from pain. But Grace's quiet strength had slipped through every crack. When he pretended to sleep now, it wasn't to test her. It was because he didn't want her to see the tears in his eyes. The storm came suddenly, sheets of rain slashing against the glass, thunder shaking the earth. Grace had stayed late to finish her work, and the lights flickered as wind howled through the trees. "Grace, you should go," Alexander said. "It's dangerous to drive in this weather." She shook her head. "I'll stay until the power's stable, sir." A few minutes later, lightning struck a tree near the estate. The mansion plunged into darkness. Alexander heard a crash from the west wing and rushed toward the sound. Grace was there, trying to protect a leaking window with a blanket. Rain soaked her completely. "Stop," he shouted, grabbing the other end of the fabric. Together they secured it, both breathing heavily, water dripping from their clothes. In that flickering candlelight, Alexander saw her face, tired, beautiful, strong. Something in him broke. "Grace," his voice was low. "Why are you so good to people who don't deserve it?" She looked at him softly. "Because someone has to be. My mama says kindness isn't about who deserves it, it's about who needs it." He turned away, his throat tight. For the first time, he wanted to confess, tell her that he had tested her, doubted her, spied on her. But shame rooted him in silence. That night, they sat together in the dim light, sipping tea as thunder rumbled. She told him about her mother's faith, her struggles, her dreams of opening a care home for elderly women someday. He listened, not as a master, not as a billionaire, but as a broken man hearing Grace in human form. When the storm passed, she rose to leave. "Good night, sir." "Grace," he whispered. "Thank you for staying." She smiled gently. "We all need someone to stay once in a while." As she disappeared down the hall, Alexander exhaled shakily. The man who had pretended to sleep had finally begun to wake. The morning after the storm, sunlight spilled across the mansion like forgiveness. For the first time in years, Alexander woke up early, not to check stocks or reports, but to stand quietly at the window and listen. Grace was in the garden, humming as she trimmed flowers, her laughter mingling with the rustle of leaves. He should have felt peace. Instead, he felt the weight of unspoken truth. The guilt he had buried was clawing its way out. Later that afternoon, his lawyer arrived to discuss business. Grace brought tea and left silently, but she dropped a small folder by mistake. When Alexander picked it up, he saw inside a few drawings hand-sketched by Grace's brother. Beautiful pencil portraits, full of life and soul. One of them was of Grace herself, smiling. He stared at it long after she left, realizing how much beauty he'd overlooked in the world while chasing wealth. But his peace was short-lived. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Stone, you've been giving large anonymous donations to that hospital." Accounting noticed. Alexander stiffened. "Handle it quietly." "Sir, if word gets out, people might think you're showing favoritism toward the help." "Toward the help." Alexander snapped. "She's a better human being than most of the board combined." The lawyer blinked in shock. Alexander dismissed him coldly, but the damage was done. The rumor began to spread among staff and neighbors. Whispers crept through the mansion, the billionaire and the maid. Grace noticed the change. People stopped smiling at her. The other servants avoided eye contact. One afternoon, she approached Alexander timidly. "Sir, have I done something wrong?" He opened his mouth to explain, but fear of ruining her dignity stopped him. "No," he said softly. "You've done everything right." She nodded uncertainly and walked away. But something in her posture told him she knew there was more. A week later, tragedy struck. Grace arrived late, pale and shaking. Her mother had gone into cardiac arrest overnight. Alexander immediately offered to drive her to the hospital. They sped through traffic in silence. When they arrived, doctors were rushing in and out of room 12. Machines beeped frantically. Grace ran to her mother's bedside, clutching her frail hand. Evelyn smiled faintly. "Don't cry, baby," she whispered. "You've done enough." "Please, Mama, don't leave me yet," Grace sobbed. Evelyn's eyes flicked toward Alexander standing quietly at the door. "You must be Mr. Stone," she said weakly. "She talks about you like your family." He stepped closer, humbled. She's more family than anyone I've known. Evelyn's breathing slowed. You take care of her. Promise me. I promise, he said, voice trembling. Moments later, the monitor flatlined. Grace screamed. Alexander turned away, his own eyes burning. He had been there for countless business funerals, but this one felt personal, because something inside him died too. That night, he sat in his car outside Grace's apartment as rain began to fall again. He couldn't bring himself to knock. He wanted to comfort her, but he was the man who had once tested her soul. What right did he have? The next day, she didn't show up for work, nor the day after. When she finally returned a week later, she looked smaller, quieter. The spark in her eyes was dim, but she still greeted him with a faint smile. I'm sorry for my absence, sir. I'm ready to work again. He nodded, his heart breaking at her composure. Later that night, he wrote a letter he'd been too cowardly to speak. Grace, I owe you the truth. The day you first came, I pretended to sleep to test you. I doubted your goodness. I spied on your pain. I was wrong. You taught me what wealth can't buy. Dignity, faith, love. If you choose to leave, I'll understand. But know this, because of you, I'm a better man. Alexander. He slipped it under her door before dawn. The next morning, Grace didn't come to work. The house felt empty, hollow. Alexander tried to focus on business calls, but failed. Every silence screamed her name. By noon, he decided to find her. He drove to her apartment and knocked. No answer. He turned to leave, but the door creaked open. Grace stood there, her eyes red from crying, holding his letter. I read it, she whispered. He swallowed hard. Then you know everything. She nodded slowly. You tested me, and yet, I should thank you. He frowned. Thank me? She stepped forward. Because if you hadn't, maybe you'd never see that people like me can still choose goodness. Maybe you'd never learn what your wealth was really for. Her voice was steady, but tears shimmered. You hurt me, Mr. Stone. But I forgive you. Because forgiveness isn't for the other person. It's for peace. He exhaled, overwhelmed. Grace, I don't deserve your forgiveness. She gave a sad smile. No one does. That's why it's called grace. She handed him a small folded paper. I'm leaving New York, sir. I'm going home to Georgia. I want to start the care home my mama dreamed of. It's time I continue her work. He stood speechless as she walked past him into the sunlight, carrying nothing but a suitcase and unshakable faith. For the first time, Alexander felt real fear, not of losing money, but of losing meaning. Months passed. The mansion returned to silence. Alexander's empire grew, but joy did not. Every corner of the house reminded him of her, the soft humming, the fresh flowers, the sunlight she'd invited into his world. One morning, a letter arrived. The envelope was worn, the handwriting familiar. Dear Mr. Stone, the Grace Home for Elderly Women opens next week. We started with nothing but hope, and your kindness made it possible. Every room bears a flower, like the ones I used to place in your home. I remember your promise to my mother. You kept it more than you know. You're welcome to visit any time. There's a bed for anyone who's tired of the world.
Grace.
Tears blurred his vision as he read. Without hesitation, he flew to Georgia. When he arrived, he found a modest white building surrounded by gardens. Elderly women sat laughing under the sun. And there, in the middle of it all, was Grace, wearing a simple white dress, radiant as ever. She turned, surprised but smiling. Mr. Stone? He nodded, voice trembling. I came to see what real wealth looks like. She chuckled softly. It looks like peace, sir. They walked through the home together, past rooms filled with music and prayer. Each woman greeted him with gratitude, unaware of his fortune, only of his quiet humility. Finally, Grace led him to a small chapel inside. This was my mama's favorite hymn, she said, lighting a candle. He closed his eyes as her voice filled the air, gentle, healing. When she finished, he whispered, You changed me. Grace smiled.
No, sir.
You just remembered who you were. Alexander looked out the window at the sun-drenched fields and said, almost to himself, "For years, I pretended to sleep. But you woke me up." Grace placed a hand over his. "Then stay awake, Mr. Stone. The world still needs you." He nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. And in that quiet chapel, surrounded by light, Alexander Stone, the man who once tested goodness, finally found redemption in the one woman who never stopped believing in it. Months later, the newspapers printed a story. Billionaire donates entire fortune to charity, citing a maid's kindness as inspiration. But Grace didn't need headlines to know. One morning, a note arrived at her care home. "Grace, you showed me heaven in simple acts. My last gift is to give back the world you taught me to see. Thank you for teaching a sleeping man how to live. Alexander." She folded the letter, tears falling gently onto her hands. Outside, the wind carried the sound of church bells. She looked up at the sky and whispered, "Rest well, sir." Then she turned back to the garden, humming softly, her voice full of peace, because in the end, even the coldest heart can be melted by the warmth of grace.